Welcome, everybody. I'm Matt Nelson, the Assistant Director of the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm here live on location in the examination schools at Oxford University in Oxford, England, and I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. In just a few moments, I'm going to be asking Bishop Barron questions submitted from our Word on Fire Institute members about the life, thought, and ministry of St. John Henry Newman. But first, I want to invite you, if you're not a Word on Fire Institute member, to go to wordonfire.institute and sign up right now. When you become a member of the Institute, you'll have access to courses from top experts on disciplines like theology, philosophy, sociology, apologetics, evangelization, literature, and other fields of expertise. But most importantly, you'll have access to Bishop Barron's brand new 12-lesson course on St. John Henry Newman. So go to wordonfire.institute and sign up now. And with that, let's jump into questions. Bishop Barron, how are you today?
I'm good. Great to be with you, Matt.
Good. So the first question I want to ask you is just about your experience just a couple days ago. You were in Rome for the canonization of now St. John Henry Newman. What was that like for you?
It was a thrill. Right there in St. Peter's Square, and I've admired Newman for so many years. When I used to teach courses at Newman, I would tell the students, now mark my words, he'll be a saint one day and a doctor of the church. So I kept thinking during the Mass, well, we're halfway there. Newman's now a saint. I was struck, too, by just all the historical and spiritual resonances in that place. There's the successor of Peter celebrating the Mass. We're right near the grave of St. Peter. We chanted the gospel that day in Latin and Greek, and I thought how Newman would have loved that because it evoked the church fathers. So all those wonderful resonances. And then during the Mass, I was right up in the front there near the altar, and looking up on the facade of the basilica was this magnificent tapestry of John Henry Newman. And I just kept thinking, boy, did he ever in his wildest imaginings think, when he arrived in Rome as a middle-aged man in about 1846, that he'd be declared a saint of the Catholic Church. And it just struck me over and over again, the wonderful kind of ironies and connections and resonances. So it was a beautiful day.
Yeah, I caught some of it, and it was a beautiful Mass. It was really moving to see all 5 of the new saints canonized that day, and so really exciting. And so now we're here in Oxford. You've been here before, and this was an exciting thing for the Word on Fire Institute members because they got to contribute to this very event that we're engaging in right now. They submitted questions that they wanted you to address while we're here, and so based on those questions, I've got those here for you today, some questions that I put together. So the first question that I want to ask you, and I think this is fitting with us sitting here in the oldest English-speaking university in the world, maybe even the most renowned university in the world, to ask you, what did St. John Henry Newman have to say about universities?
Yeah, first you're right in suggesting that this is Newman's town in many ways. He was an Oxford man. It defined him his whole life long. Even after he became a Catholic and left his formal teaching and fellowship here, he remained an Oxford man. It was in his blood and his bones. And of course, he writes the magnificent Idea of a University, one of his great texts, still of enormous influence today. I think what Newman saw, so many things, but one is the importance of a truly liberal education. So we're obsessed, especially now, with practicality, with mechanics, with how to get things done, to be practical. Even our higher disciplines, think of engineering and so on, are usually geared toward something pragmatic. Newman insisted upon the value of a properly liberal education, liberal from the word in Latin for free, and that means free of practicality. In other words, something which is not subordinated to a good outside of itself, but is sought for its own sake. So that's Aristotle's famous definition, that the liberal sciences are those that are the highest because they're good in themselves. Just like playing baseball is something liberal, meaning you don't do it for some other purpose, you do it because it's good. Well, philosophy is like that. And Newman felt that the purpose of a university ultimately is to produce the philosophical habit. So studying all the various disciplines, yes, but the overall purpose was to give this sort of universal view of things, the interrelationship among the various disciplines, and to see them as good in themselves, as beautiful and valuable in themselves. And that, I think, remains to this day an extremely important and valuable contribution.
What did Saint John Henry Newman?
Yeah.
That sounds good. What did he have to say about the university in terms of helping somebody become a gentleman? That was the word he used when he talked about the purpose of a liberal arts education and developing this philosophical habit.
Yeah, and that's it. That's shorthand for what I was just describing. The person that has the philosophical habitus would be a gentleman. And you know, as an Englishman, he rated gentlemanliness as a very high level. But the interesting thing is Newman said, that's the purpose of a university. The purpose of the church is to make not the gentleman, but the saint. And he defined the saint really over and against the gentleman in some ways. Gentlemen, he said, make you feel comfortable and at ease. They're like a fine fire or a comfortable chair. Saints, last time I checked and last time he checked, were often anything but comfortable figures. They were edgy and challenging and disturbing figures. Think of everyone from Jeremiah the prophet through Jerome and Francis of Assisi and in our time Mother Teresa. They're not really comfortable figures. So that was an important distinction. Yes, the university, which inculcates the philosophical habit, produces gentlemen, but the church is meant to produce something else, namely the saint.
So could we see a university as a sort of precursor to then the church, in the sense that becoming a gentleman or becoming gentlemanly is in a way preparing somebody but not getting them the whole way to being holy?
Yeah, there's something of the nature-grace distinction there. So Newman affirmed being a gentleman. He wasn't against it at all, on the contrary. But being a saint was something beyond it. So it's not eschewing nature or denigrating it, but then also insisting there's something more than that. So that was the tension built into those essays on the university. He loved the university, loved what it was about, loved what it was meant to produce. But he didn't want to reduce sanctity to being a gentleman. He didn't want to reduce the purpose of the church to the purpose of a university. So he kept, I would say, a healthy tension between nature and grace.
Good. Let's stick with this conversation about the university for another question. I'm interested to know, do you think that St. John Henry Newman would have thought that theology belonged in even the secular universities? And how do you personally feel about that?
No, he clearly did. And by theology there, he wouldn't have meant so much the formal theology of the church. He would have meant what they called in those days natural theology. So theology based upon reason, philosophical reason. And Newman felt, if it's a university, that means it has to include all the disciplines. Why wouldn't you include the discipline that speaks of God? Because God impinges upon all things. Is God operative in history? Yes, obviously. Does God inspire much of the literature of the world? Obviously. Is God implicated in the sciences? Well, sure, in the measure that all the sciences depend upon the intelligibility of the world, which in turn is a result of creation, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so how could you be a university in good faith if you didn't have a discipline dedicated to that which impinges upon everything else? Furthermore, and I think it's a very important part of his argument, is theology belongs in the center of the university disciplines. And there Newman echoes someone like Bonaventure in the Middle Ages. When you extricate theology from the position in the center, nature pours a vacuum. Something else will move into that central position. And Newman saw that very clearly mid-19th century. Do we see it today? I would say in spades, precisely in the scientism that dominates our intellectual life. What's moved into the center of all the disciplines but science? I can't tell you how many times in my work, on the internet, people will say some version of, well, science is what you mean by reason. To be reasonable is to be scientific, right? And I say, well, wrong. Science is indeed a form of reasonability, but not the only one. And what's happened there is the supplanted theology has now been replaced by science. When I was coming of age, psychology maybe had that central, all-defining position. Beware, said Newman in the mid-19th century, when that happens, you'll have a distortion of all the disciplines. When theology is, as the Middle Ages saw it, the Regina Scientiarum, right? It was the queen of the sciences. Right. When it was in the properly central position, the other sciences maintained their integrity. I think that observation remains enormously important today.
In your course on St. John Henry Newman, you talk about this, you go into greater depth. And as I was contemplating what you teach in that course and then thinking about the questions I'd be asking you today, as I was thinking about theology in the secular university, I thought of a comment once made by Paul Davies. He's a renowned physicist and he's an agnostic. But he commented once on modern science and the advancements in science, what it now tells us almost forces us now into a sort of theological position. And so that's another thing I think to consider when we talk about theology in the secular university.
Wasn't he the one, in fact, who challenged his scientific colleagues? Where do the laws of nature come from? So, I mean, all of science rests upon this fundamental assumption of intelligibility, and we put that in terms of the laws of science. Call them even patterns of probability if you want, but all of science rests upon that. And wasn't it he who, in a famous article, challenged his colleagues to say, okay, where'd that come from?
He has, I'm not sure, but he has been a voice in the scientific community that has challenged his colleagues. And as an agnostic, he's written a couple books and has
right, that he is indeed an agnostic, but that he thought that was a fair question to tease out.
Yeah.
Like, all right, well, then give me your best account of it.
Yeah.
Why should the world be structured in such a way that it corresponds to the most complex type of mathematics? You know, look at the highest level. Physics always involves very complex mathematics. Why should it be the case that reality is describable in that way?
Yeah.
Well, we would say the intelligibility of the world is grounded in something like an intelligence that has thought it into being, so that every act of science, as Ratzinger once said, is a recognitio, right? It's a recognition. It's a rethinking of what's already been thought. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah.
And why I think something like theology, or call it natural theology, belongs in the circle of university disciplines.
Yeah, and something that he's doing that I think Newman would have respected is the fact that he sees that faith and reason have a sort of compatibility between the two. And so he's agnostic, but he's not resting easily in agnosticism. He's open to the conversation.
And that's a salutary thing today, when you've got a lot of the scientistic point of view. The new atheists are dripping with scientism, and they'll play that card over and over again, but it's such a self-refuting card in a way. Because the sciences can't explain their own ground. They can't articulate on their own terms the ground upon which they stand.
Right.
You need a higher discipline to do that. The classical authors understood that, and we go back to Aristotle, understood that. Aquinas would have understood that. Newman understood it. And that's something needed today.
Yeah, we could keep going on that topic for a long time, but I know this is a question that our Word on Fire Institute members will be waiting for, and that's basically for book recommendations. Now, let's talk about Newman's books for a moment. Two questions. One is, what do you think, objectively speaking, is the most important book that Newman wrote for us today? The second part of the question is, for you personally, what's been the most significant book he wrote for you?
Yeah, your first question, I guess I would say The Grammar of Assent, that magnificent late career masterpiece of Newman's that's full of so many important distinctions and clarifications and insights. The fact that Bernard Lonergan, who wrote his great book, Insight, in the mid-20th century, said he read Newman's grammar something like 12 times before he sat down to write Insight, you know. I think what we're getting from the grammar, the importance of probability rather than certitude as the best epistemic guide. And here's what I mean. Now you can trace some of this back to people like Plato, but in the modern period, Descartes bequeathed to the West, I would say, a certain obsession with certitude, you know? How can you be certain of something? And so Descartes, as we know, famously doubts all that can be doubted. Coming up finally with the cogito, the one thing you can't doubt is that you're a doubter. So I think, therefore I am. But now, watch all the great modern thinkers that follow him. They're too obsessed with this question of certitude. Newman said the grammar came from an insight, namely, don't start with certitude, start with assent. Why do we give assent to propositions? We say, yes, that's true. Now, why do we do that? And Newman said, we hardly ever do it because we have apodictic inferential support for it. So I assent to that because I've got an absolutely convincing argument that no one could deny. It's hardly ever the case. Rather, as he famously says, it's typically from a whole congeries of arguments indeed, but also, insights and hunches and examples and experiences that all converge to the same place. And that leads me, by this inner sense he called the illative sense, it leads me to say, finally, yes, that's true. His famous example being, how do you know Great Britain's an island? We don't have an apodictic, syllogistic argument to come to that conclusion, but it's based, as he says, on all sorts of insights, examples, histories, your own personal experience, all coming together around the conclusion that Great Britain's an island. That's the way the mind typically functions. And see, I like that a lot. It gets you out of the Cartesian obsession with certitude and aligns you more toward understanding, come into a deeper understanding of things by a process both intellectual and experiential, emotional, etc. I think that epistemic move is of extraordinary importance for our own time.
I want to get back to the grammar of assent.
Well, who doesn't want to get back?
Well, maybe we need to read it 14 times before we can really have a conversation about it, like Lonergan. But let's, before we go back to that book, talk a little bit about your personal choice, which has been most significant for you.
Well, for me, it's the Apologio Pro Vita Sua. It's his autobiography. And the reason for that is when I was a kid at the University of Notre Dame, and I was just thinking about the priesthood at that point, and I met with this wonderful priest, Father Tom McNally, still alive in his mid-90s now. And we were talking away, and he sensed that I had intellectual interests. He said, I think a book you should read is John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, and he described it as his autobiography. Well, I had heard of neither Newman nor the book at that point, but I went to the Notre Dame bookstore, and I found it, and I still have it. I bought this little red-covered paperback, about this big. Now it's all wrinkled and dog-eared. I think I glanced at it when I was 18, and it meant so little to me. I didn't really understand it, and I put it aside. But many years later, I came back to that book, and as you know, it's Newman sort of telling of the story of his conversion, how he moves, from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism. But there's something so compelling about that story, and so rich, and so beautifully told. It's being written around the same time as Dickens's novels and all that, and it came out the same way Dickens' novels came out, like in installations, and people would stand in line to wait for the next installment, of the Apologia. It's had that impact on me as I've read it over the years, I've taught it. Newman's story, it's a bit like Augustine's story, that his own life becomes a template that a lot of people follow and fit their own lives into. So that book has meant a lot to me, and as I say, that little red paperback, I still have it. How many years later is that? 40-some years later. Yeah. And it means a lot to me.
And that book was autobiographical, but it was a defense.
Yeah,
and
Apologia.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, he was accused by a fellow named Charles Kingsley, who was an Anglican controversialist at the time, and he accused Newman of being indifferent to the truth, and it was based on an earlier sermon of Newman. Well, that was like waving a red, cape before a bull. Because Newman was dedicated, hyper-dedicated to the truth. But he answered Kingsley. Kingsley answered back, and Newman thought, okay, to answer this sufficiently, I need to tell my whole story. Right. And so the book comes out of that experience.
Well, and the fact that that it's being written with that kind of a tone of answering somebody who's challenged him, gives the book a really interesting feel when you're reading through it.
And see, Newman was not so much a pure intellectual, meaning someone that looked at ideas for their own sake. He was always a controversialist, and I think he would have embraced that description more than theologian. He often said, I'm not a theologian. I'm not like Augustine or Aquinas. Yeah. He was more of an apologist or a controversialist, more of an intellectual kind of street fighter, meaning he was always engaged with someone. And I think his purpose was to bring people to conversion. He himself had undergone this conversion, and he wanted everyone else to as well. He wanted to bring people to what he felt was the fullness of the faith. Yeah. So there was always kind of a fighting edge. And man, was he a good satirist, and he had a bit of a poison pen. I mean, if you got on Newman's wrong side, he'll let you have it, literarily speaking.
Right. Yeah. No. But yet there's always a tone of charity, even though he's at times in a sort of appropriate and balanced way coming on strong.
Yeah, he's polemical.
Yeah.
But I mean, so was Augustine, so was
Yeah.
Jerome, so was Chrysostom. Read most of the fathers. I mean, they're very polemical.
And compelling.
I think he would have gotten it from them more than from his own time. He would have gotten it from reading the church fathers.
Yeah. Well, when we were talking about key influencers in his conversion, who did you say were the key influencers for his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism?
I would say the fathers. And it's not, and there were some people in his own time, some Catholics that he was reading. But I would say the prime influence were the church fathers. His area of great interest was the controversies of the 4th century. And it was this study of those controversies that led him finally to say, I see a disturbing analogy between the Anglicanism of my own time and the heretical positions of the ancient world. And so I think it was a careful reading of the fathers that led him finally to his conversion to Catholicism.
Yeah. Well, let's jump back now to the grammar of assent, because what I'd like you to do for our viewers is, could you draw the distinction between real and notional assent? Those are two terms that Newman discusses a lot in that book, and I think they're very applicable to our time now. Can you talk about, number one, what he meant by those terms, but also then, in your method of evangelization, which usually involves beauty as the arrowhead of the whole program, talk about how Newman's thought on real and notional assent ultimately leads then to your strategy for evangelization today.
Yeah. The distinction really is a simple one. A notional assent is one that I give to an abstraction or a proposition, an idea. Mm-hmm. And Newman loved propositions and abstractions and ideas, and he realized that notional assent always has a role to play in our coming to know things correctly. So that's the first type. But it's sharply to be distinguished from real assent, which is the assent I give to particulars, to this experience, to this image. It's always correlated to something very factual in front of me, nuts and bolts. And see, there I would see the influence of another important Oxford figure, namely Duns Scotus. Go right back to the Middle Ages. Duns Scotus felt that the epistemology he inherited from the classical world and that Thomas Aquinas represented was still way too abstract. And so Scotus has this idea of haixeitas, which is particularity. He coined that term. It means thisness. So I can abstract the form of glass from this object. But he thought the mind didn't want just that. It wanted, what's this thing, this particular, what's the haixeitas, the form of particularity? There's a lot of that in Newman, I think. And that corresponds to what he called real assent. Now, both are involved in the process of coming to know. He did not have a contempt for the first, and it wasn't a simple-minded distinction. But he did feel that it's real assent that moves us to action. That if you want to move people to change, to do something, you'd appeal more to the real than to the notional. We had the privilege today of going out to Blenheim Palace and visiting the Tomb of Churchill, and I always felt Churchill got this in his bones. I mean, Churchill was someone obviously who knew how to use propositions and ideas, but when Churchill wanted to move this country to action, all I've got to give you is blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We're going to fight on the beaches. We're going to fight on the landing grounds. We're going to fight, with increasing strength in the air. We're going to fight. And notice there, Newman would have appreciated this. He's using very Anglo-Saxon words there. Because in English, we have that wonderful confluence of two streams. There's the more Latinate stream that came from French, and then there's the more Anglo-Saxon stream. And we associate the Latinate words with propositions, the Anglo-Saxon words with the real, right? Mm-hmm. So Churchill was giving us blood, toil, tears, sweat, fight, beaches. It's all Anglo-Saxon words. Real assent language moves people to action. So Newman wanted to move people to action. Why? Because he was a Catholic apologist. He wanted to bring people to the Catholic faith, to undergo a conversion. And therefore you needed, he thought, primarily real assent to make that happen.
So talk a little bit then about, before we get into the beauty portion of the question, talk about now illative sense and the illative sense and how that applies to these ideas.
Well, the illative sense is the epistemic correlate to something like conscience.
Okay.
So, I mean, conscience is able to assess the situation and take things in and then say, this is the direction I should go in, morally speaking. Think of like prudence, you know. Now put it in the epistemic context. As I assess this hunch, this insight, this experience, this idea, this argument, this witness, and I assess all of it, and I see them all converging at one point. It's the illative sense, Newman felt, that leads me to assent, that says, yes, it brings together, it assesses, it correlates all of these influences, and then moves the mind to assent. So it's a sensibility.
Okay.
You know?
Would you say that the illative sense, in a way, brings together the notional and the real?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right. It would help to bring all of it together, and that's the way. Here's where the rubber meets the road, because that's how we, in fact, 99% of the time, make decisions. Why we say yes, that's true. We can hardly ever say, "Oh, let me show you the argument." Premise A, premise B, conclusion. Got it? That's why we hardly ever operate that way. That might be part of it. There might be an argument I could conjure up. But usually it's by this whole complex process. And the illative sense is that feel. It's like when people ask me, how come you became a priest? Well, I mean, I can never give an answer.
Right.
Or someone say, how come you married your wife? I mean, you can't just come up with, well, here's major premise, minor premise, conclusion.
Yeah.
There's a whole variety, in my case of becoming a priest, of reasons why. The illative sense, is what assesses all of that and leads me to say, yes, I'm going to make this change in my life and become a priest. Or in your case, I'm going to marry this woman. And I think Newman had great psychological insight. He was not a in the clouds philosopher when it came to the act of knowing. He was a psychologically perceptive man.
So, yeah, Newman was interested not just in saying yes, but then acting upon that yes. And you talk about how beauty has this power to move us into action, essentially.
Yeah.
So then what's the relationship between how beauty acts on us and how we experience real assent?
Yeah, well, that's a good example of it. It's because, I can be, moving in the direction of believing in God, but then I walk into Chartres Cathedral, and I see the rose window, and I see that place, and it has that weird, almost alchemical influence on me. It starts changing me, I think of the famous Cardinal Lustiger, who was Archbishop of Paris when I was a student there many years ago. A Jew, his mother died in the Shoah, and he was sent to a Catholic family for kind of safekeeping during the Holocaust. And he wanders one day into one of the great Gothic cathedrals, and that changed him. Or the famous example of Paul Claudel, the great French playwright,
Right.
standing in I know exactly where it was, at Notre Dame in Paris, looking up at the rose window, and that's when it came together. It was the beautiful that, to use Newman's language now, I think prompted this real assent to the proposition that God is real, God exists, my life has to change. And I'm sure both Lustiger and Claudel knew arguments, and I wouldn't discount for a minute that they played a role. I think in my own life, an argument for God's existence when I was a kid played a big role in moving me to a deeper appreciation of religion. But I would never say, oh, that's it. It's this argument. That's why, no, it was the beginning of a process. It was a magnet around which a lot of things gathered, But I think Newman is especially sensitive to the complexity of this psychological and epistemic process by which we come to assent.
Yeah, and he had a real gift for seeing the complexity, but then writing in a really engaging way. As as profound and sometimes as careful as you have to be reading him. Theologically speaking, he's had great influence, and you talk about his influence at the Second Vatican Council. The ironic thing is, he was dead by the time the Second Vatican Council came around.
Right, but I've said he's maybe the most important dead person at Vatican II. So there were a lot of important players at the council, the periti, the theological experts. But among the heavenly players, I'd put Newman near the front rank, because think of so many of the periti at Vatican II. De Lubac and Bouillet and Danielou and Ratzinger. Balthasar wasn't there, but he was very influenced by Newman. All these people carried a very Newman-esque influence. You know what it was, Matt, I think? It was the importance of the Church Fathers. Newman is a proto-Nouvelle Theologie figure in this way. The Nouvelle Theologie figures, mid-20th century, tended to leap over the Middle Ages and the Reformation and those debates, and they went back on purpose to the Church Fathers. And they found a time when Christianity was united. So before the great splits, whether it's the 1054 split or the 1517 split, they went back before those. And they found this sort of compelling Christian space of the Church Fathers. Well, who anticipated all that? 100 years before the Nouvelle Theologie, John Henry Newman. He had nothing but respect for Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic method are conspicuous by their absence in Newman. What do you find in Newman? It said, the fathers, the fathers, the fathers. And I think that's what influenced your de Lubacs and Bouillets and Balthasars and Ratzingers. And they, in turn, massively influenced the Vatican Council. Thomas, again, I have nothing but reverence for Thomas myself, but he's also relatively absent from the Vatican II documents, but they are redolent of the Church Fathers. That's very much of a Newman impact, I think, at Vatican II, but he's certainly a major player.
What was it that John Tracy Ellis said about Newman that really caught your attention?
This was many years ago. I was a first-year philosophy student at Catholic University. I was getting my master's degree, my first year in the master's program. And I was at Theological College, and to our house for daily mass this one night came the famous John Tracy Ellis, who at the time was about 80 maybe, and he was generally regarded as the dean of American Catholic Church historians. He was the great figure. Wrote the great biography of Cardinal Gibbons. He was Cardinal Dolan's thesis director. Oh, really? So a very major player, And he gave this wonderful, it was atypical at the time, believe me, but this wonderful classic stem-winding sort of sermon, in the course of which he said, as a kind of, obiter dictum, he said, John Henry Newman, the greatest Catholic theologian since Thomas Aquinas. And I was a kid, and I knew Newman from Father Tom McNally telling me about this book, but I knew almost nothing about him. But I tucked that away. I thought, wow, this very weighty figure has just said that the greatest theologian since Thomas Aquinas is John Henry Newman. And I tucked that away thinking, boy, I've got to read this fellow someday with greater care, which I did. But Ellis played a role in my own, appreciation of Newman.
It's been interesting to see how St. John Henry Newman and St. Thomas Aquinas have both influenced you. Yeah. It's, I don't know, maybe in a way it's reminiscent of Herbert McCabe, who many people called a Thomist, but himself didn't like that label, and he was influenced by so many different people.
But McCabe is I think, a wonderful Thomist. Yeah. But reads Thomas in a very fresh way. Yeah. And I'm happy to say both Aquinas and Newman have influenced me, even though Newman, as I say, wasn't really very Thomist and didn't have a lot in common with Thomas, but for me, they're very complementary figures. I say, the great Catholic both and is on display there. Bring them both on, sure. I like both Newman and Thomas.
Yeah, you've kind of been a master of finding the best of what everybody has to offer and then making something of that. And I think that really is something for all of us to learn in this time, in this culture, when we're setting out to evangelize, do apologetics. There's so much to learn about this from so many different angles, so many different influencers.
Right. Well, I've always hated that. I'm glad you bring that up, because I've always hated that way of reading the tradition. As though there's one voice who's just got it right, and then with everybody else, all I'm going to do is notice how they disagree with the one voice I think is really right. It's such an ungenerous and finally un-Catholic way to read. And I'll take as Exhibit A Thomas Aquinas himself, how did he read the great intellectual tradition? With a tremendous generosity of spirit. Thomas wasn't dwelling on the mistakes of those that came before him. On the contrary, he tends to say, here's what's wonderful in Aristotle, here's what's wonderful in Plato, here's what's really worthwhile in Cicero. Here, by the way, is what's really worthwhile in Moses Maimonides, my rabbi, colleague intellectually. Here's what's really interesting and important in Averroes and Avicenna and Avicebron, my Islamic colleagues. Did he disagree with all those people? Yes, very clearly. But it's a generous way of reading the intellectual tradition. What I don't like is that sort of cramped, defensive, very un-Catholic way to read the tradition, whereby I choose one figure who is it, he's it, that's the person, and everyone else I'm going to snipe at them and show how wrong they are. Where's that get us? I would say, why not benefit from all these great figures? Yeah. Look, I'm a Thomist. I disagree with key elements in Duns Scotus, but I just sang the praises of Duns Scotus 20 minutes ago because I think there are wonderful things in Duns Scotus. Yeah. So anyway, I just think that's a sort of meta point, but don't read the Catholic tradition in that cramped, defensive way. It doesn't help. Read it as generously as Aquinas did.
And be open to anywhere you hear the truth.
And that's what Thomas said. Yeah. Wherever the truth is found, God has spoken there. Thomas says that. So you hear the truth from an Islamic scholar. Good. God's spoken there. And who would ever accuse of Thomas Aquinas of being somehow a religious relativist? But he had that generous way of approaching the intellectual tradition.
And Newman was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. And even with Darwin's thought, Newman wasn't outright opposed to what Darwin had to say. What did Newman say about Darwin's theory of evolution? Was he open to that?
Well, he was, and rather unusually for the time, he was a Christian who said, I don't think this poses any sort of threat to authentic Catholic orthodoxy. And there were Christians who were deeply concerned about Darwin. I think Newman was very much ahead of his time. He was also very interested in mathematics and the sciences. And I think that's very hopeful. I'd also say this about Newman and Darwin. As you say, writing right around the same time. They were both part of this Lebensphilosophie movement. So think of a figure like Hegel in Germany. Lebensphilosophie means philosophy of life, or life philosophy. The stress was on how things develop and unfold, and how events and ideas and so on are alive across history. They're not simply statically given, right? So much of classical philosophy is predicated upon the assumption that you've got static essences and forms that are simply given. Now, Newman didn't deny essences and forms, but he tended to see how they unfold themselves across space and time. So think of Newman's essay on the development of doctrine as a kind of parallel text in a way to The Origin of Species. So Darwin showing how species, in fact, unfold over space and time. So ideas unfold over space and time. Controversial at its time? Yeah, it sure was, Newman's theory. Generally accepted at Vatican II? Absolutely. Something I find intriguing is that Vatican II itself is a sort of ratification of Newman's theory. What do you find at Vatican II when you read those documents carefully is not a repudiation of anything that came before, but rather a development of doctrine. How can you read Lumen Gentium, for example, and not see real development in regard to ecclesiology? How can you read Dignitatis Humanae and not see development in regard to the kind of church-state relationship question? Newman insisted every legitimate development has a conservative action upon its past. So he's no relativist. He's not in favor of radical ruptures. But development, you bet. And Vatican II, by its very nature in a way, ratifies that point of view. That brings him close to Darwin, it seems to me, in sort of a Lebensphilosophie context.
So then, on that topic of interacting with people who we would not perhaps agree much with, who we wouldn't hold faith in common with, interacting with non-believers, today in the world of popular apologetics, the popular arguments are usually cosmological arguments or design arguments, which are great. They have a place. But Newman took a unique approach because he began with the conscience, didn't he, when it came to the existence of God?
Yeah, and he knew, of course, the tradition of the more cosmological arguments. He knew in his own time, Paley, who proposed the famous, Watchmaker. It's kind of a design argument. Newman was very impatient with those. He didn't exactly repudiate them, but he was impatient with them. One reason is they dealt so much at the notional level, and he felt that they wouldn't move people to real change. And also, relatedly, they didn't come to the particularity of the God of the Bible. Now, what did? He searched for a real access to God. Is there a possibility of giving real assent? And his answer was, yeah, through conscience. Because the conscience gives me, he felt, a vivid, visceral experience of a moral judge. Someone, that's why we speak of the voice of the conscience, as opposed to like my aesthetic sensibility, let's say, or even like the illative sense. But conscience, we say, it's the voice. I heard the voice of my conscience. Now, why? Because it puts us in the presence, he felt, of a judge who sees my interior life and determines that, you're acting rightly or wrongly. What does it give me? Not just a sense of, some distant first cause, but of a living person who's present to me in the sort of intimacy of my interior life, who is a moral judge, who rewards and punishes, who is of providential import. All of that, Newman felt, brought you much more in line with a biblical understanding of God. And it made the experience of God unavoidable, and it pushed you to action. So his approach to apologetics is precisely that. Begin with the conscience, and you'll get to the biblical idea of God.
Good. Well, apologetics, properly understood, is part of our task of increasing Christian unity throughout the world. And I wish we could sit here for another hour and go through so many more questions, because there were so many more good questions.
We're out of questions,
offered.
or
we got one more left for today. So I'm going to go right to the last question I wanted to ask you before we wrap this up. And that is, what does St. John Henry Newman have to teach us, especially Catholics and Anglicans, about moving towards greater unity among us?
It's a good question, and there's a number of ways to answer it. What comes to my mind, though, is this, especially today. The distinctions and fights among ourselves maybe aren't as important as our common fight against a common enemy. And what I mean is, all biblical people, all people of faith, are standing against right now a very aggressive secularism. Denies the existence of God, denies the existence of objective moral values, denies much of the classical, biblical view of things. Anglicans and Catholics could sort of fight and fuss about what still divides us, or we could make common cause as biblical people and say we got to enter into the lists against this very aggressive secularism. And that might be a way to find real unity in a common shared battle. Something I often say in ecumenical conversations when I have them now is that, look, we could fight about the 16th century till the cows come home. We've been doing it for 500 years. Or we can make common cause, And I think that might be an instinct that Newman would have had.
And we've made some advances, especially with the Church of England and over the years.
Oh, indeed. Quite right. And we could explore that line. You're quite right. But I just wonder, it might be the best way to find real unity today is make common cause against this, rather threatening enemy.
Well, thanks so much, Bishop Barron. I wish we could go through more questions. We've definitely got more questions to look at, but maybe for a future time.
Love it.
So for all of you watching, go to wordonfire.institute. Join the Word on Fire Institute, where you can become a member and take in Bishop Barron's brand new course. Go to wordonfire.institute. We'd love to have you aboard. And Bishop Barron, would you want to give us some last words and maybe a final blessing?
Sure. The last word would just be gratitude, Matt, to you and to all the viewers. I'm so happy Newman now canonized. We pray to Newman, and I hope this canonization draws greater attention to him and to his writings. I think he remains for people today very much of a pivotal player. So I'm pleased about that. And let me give a final blessing to our viewers. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son and the Holy Spirit come down upon you and remain with you forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen.